All right. So, welcome to our Naturally Speaking program. If you don't know, our Naturally Speaking series is a monthly program. It's always the first Thursday evening of every month, and that rotates between seasonally appropriate topics throughout the year. So, tonight we're going to be talking about prescribed fire and benefits of prescribed fire. Other topics we've done in the past. We just wrapped up. One of our staff did a snowy owls presentation. We have a presentation on salamanders coming up. So if you like the format for this and the time slot works, keep an eye out for those every first Thursday evening of the month, different topic. So yeah, tonight we'll be talking prescribed fire, benefits of prescribed fire, and how we're using that as a management tool in our parks. So just briefly, and then I'm going to hand it off to Emily, a little bit about Ottawa County Parks if you're not super familiar. We have about 45 properties across our park system now. Here's a map of all of our properties. So you can see a lot along river systems like the Grand River. We manage over 7,500 acres, which keeps us pretty busy. We also have over 150 miles of regional trails that we manage. So like the Idaho Explorers Trail, if you're familiar with that, is one of our trails that we manage. So within the larger organization, we are lucky enough as a county park system to have our own natural resources management division, which is pretty rare. A lot of times in a county park system, or especially when you get smaller, like a city or township system, the folks that are doing natural resource management wear a lot of hats, and they're also doing programming and administrative work. Whereas we're lucky enough to have 7 staff within our NRM division. Amazingly talented staff, and some of the different areas we focus on are forest health management, invasive species management. Those 2 alone take up just about 2/3 of our time. We also do restoration projects like native plantings, a little bit of prescribed fire, research projects, and occasionally some public programming. So we like these times because we get to share out what we do, and a lot of times we're just out in the woods by ourselves and don't always get to share that out. So with that, and I'll introduce myself too. So I'm Tyler, I'm the stewardship supervisor, and I kind of coordinate our management throughout the year, supervise our technicians, and try to make sure we're getting everything done. And behind me is Emily. So Emily is our stewardship technician, who is in charge of our northern region parks and also helps co-manage our fire department. So she's gonna take it from here. And if you want to introduce yourself anymore, feel free. Otherwise, and we're gonna do questions at the very end too. So if you have questions, just hold on.
Okay, I think Tyler did a good job introducing me. I'm one of the stewardship technicians for Ottawa County Parks. And yeah, I like fire, so I'll give you guys this presentation. So a little outline of what we're going to be covering today. A lot of history of Michigan specifically, of fire in Michigan, of fire suppression in Michigan. Some fancy terms, fire in succession, I'll explain that later. Some prescribed fire history, and then after all of that, then we'll dive into fire in Ottawa County Parks specifically. So fire in Michigan. I wanted to start off with this quote from Dr. Evan Larson. I think it really sums up the history that I'm about to talk about, and that is, the ecological communities found throughout the Great Lakes region today have never existed before, have never existed without fire, and have never existed without people. So I'll just dive right into that. So since the glaciers retreated from Michigan about 14,000 years ago, the landscape has changed dramatically. Since that time, and through present day, fire has acted as a governing force for new plant communities as the glaciers retreated. Fire was a regular occurrence and typically brought by either lightning or by people. And the fire shaped the ecosystems that we see here today. So I split up this history from 14,000 years ago to 500 years ago, and then 500 years ago to today, mainly because the past 500 years have brought about a rapid and significant amount of change in terms of fire in the landscape especially. So that's mostly due to European colonization and logging. This has dramatically changed the landscape. And then through this also there's been fire suppression and wildfires, and then now prescribed fires. I wanted to mention the original catastrophic wildfires that have led to the fire suppression that we have had for the past several hundred years, led to the fire suppression to keep communities safe. And that was, the wildfires were a result typically of the huge areas of dead brush and timber following the timber era. I wanted to touch on some traditional and cultural importance of fire. So, sorry guys, I'm nervous. The Anishinaabe people of this region created the Council of Three Fires, and this includes the Ojibwe, Odawa, and Potawatomi. And these people have existed on the landscape for hundreds of years, and they still do today. But they have used fire for many different reasons. In the Ottawa language, or sorry, the Ojibwe language, they call fire ishgode, and they see it as a manadu, and in their language that means spirit. So it has, the spirit fire has its own agency, so when they release on a landscape, they kind of just let it do its own thing. But some uses for it were in ceremonies. They used it to cultivate medicine and food. They would use it for materials as well, to create landscapes that would grow materials for them. They used it for travel and for openings, so they would use fire to clear an area to create spaces for them to travel and to build villages. And I also wanted to highlight blueberries are very important to Indigenous cultures, and blueberries are actually fire dependent, so they would use fire on the landscape to cultivate blueberries. So the historic fire frequency of this area kind of depends on the ecosystem type and the human presence. So ecosystems that are fire dependent usually experience fire either within the same year or up to 10 years apart. And then ecosystems that do not need fire would typically experience it much less often, several hundred to 1,000 years. And the ecosystems that are fire dependent, the fires that would return regularly are typically very low intensity. And then for non-fire dependent ecosystems, those would typically be a little more intense than the fire dependent ecosystems. I'm going to get into the history of fire suppression. There are a few reasons why fire was suppressed. I very briefly touched on it, but during the timber era, timber was seen as very valuable to the European settlers, and they did not want it all burning down. And also with this, culture changes shifted with the European settlers. They typically viewed fire as something that was very dangerous, and that is true, fire can be dangerous. But their culture shifted dramatically. And then with agriculture and urban expansion, it fragmented the habitats that would usually burn, making it more difficult for fire to spread across the landscape. And fire suppression has resulted in two main issues that we see today, and that is an increase in wildfire risk, especially intense wildfires, And then this fancy term that I'll explain in a minute is mesophication. So basically with wildfires, the increased risk of wildfires, the lack of fire from fire suppression has led to a fuel accumulation. So all that like leaf litter and sticks and dried out timber, those are all fuel types. And the more that accumulates, the more intense the fire will be that burns these fuels. And I want to point out that historic wildfires would have been significantly less intense and damaging because there wasn't such a prolonged period of fire suppression between burns. So this fancy term, mesophication, is the process by which an open and dry fire-dependent ecosystem transitions to a closed, wet, fire-sensitive ecosystem. This process makes it more difficult for fire to return to the landscape, and it significantly affects the biodiversity as well. So the fire-dependent ecosystem is full of fire-dependent species, and as fire-sensitive species encroach on these landscapes, you lose those fire-dependent species, which decreases that biodiversity over time. And a little more on that. These are just some examples of species that depend on fire in fire-maintained ecosystems, like sundial lupin, bur oak, the eastern box turtle. These are pretty common to be seen in fire-dependent ecosystems, but as those have declined, so have these species. So fire and succession, and I will explain what succession means. This kind of touches that mesophication that I just mentioned. Succession describes the process of change in an ecosystem over time. And there are two main types of succession, that is primary succession and secondary succession. Primary succession, it typically occurs in stages, and this happens on a landscape that does not have a pre-existing plant community or community in general. It's usually on barren landscapes with no life on them. And secondary succession occurs on landscapes that already have a pre-existing environment, and it typically is caused by a disturbance event, which just I want to say disturbances aren't always bad. Sometimes they can be good for the environment, but typically a disturbance will happen and kind of set the succession back to an earlier stage. And then the succession will continue from there. Some examples, after the glaciers receded, primary succession took place from a completely barren landscape of just bare rock, essentially, and communities, plant communities came in from there and built what we see today. And then secondary succession, a great example is a low intensity fire that would set this successional stage to an earlier one. So there are many types of fire-dependent ecosystems. They can range from grasslands to savannas to forests, and there are different types of each of those. The most common one for grasslands is prairies. You'll most often see oak savannas or pine savannas or a combination of the two. And for forests, you'll see forests dominated by jack pine, red pine, or oak. So for grasslands, these ecosystems are quite fire dependent as they need fire to keep the woody plants from encroaching in on them. The fire helps maintain the native biodiversity. It keeps invasive species out and it keeps the woody plants out. And it's not all just grasses. There are also plenty of wildflowers that grow in these areas as well that need fire. Savannas are kind of that in between a grassland or a prairie and a forest. So they have components of both. They have lots of grasses and flowers or forbs, but they also have woody plants. So they'll typically experience a fire frequency that maybe is less often or less intense to allow for those woody plants to grow here. And the woody plants that do grow here are fire adapted, so they will typically have thicker bark that can allow the trees to survive the low intensity fires. And kind of same thing with forests. The trees that exist here are fire adapted, so the low intensity fires won't harm them. And I want to point out, if you notice in these two photos, the canopy is more open. You can see the sky. This is pretty typical of a forest that has experienced fire regularly. In forests where they don't experience fire, that canopy is going to be very closed. You won't be able to see the sky through the canopy. But that fire that opens up the canopy a little bit allows for light to reach the forest floor, which can increase the biodiversity of the ground cover. So I'm going to get into the history of prescribed fire in Michigan specifically. And I have this split up into two slides, but so I mentioned there has been cultural fire on the landscape for thousands of years. But I want to point out that the indigenous people of this area don't really consider the cultural fire as prescribed fire in the same way that we do today, or the same way that we consider prescribed fire. But I still wanted to include it in here because it was still an intentional use of fire on the landscape. And then following European settlement, Europeans actually did use fire to clear land for farming and for land development shortly after they arrived. And then I couldn't really find anything on prescribed fire until 1936 in Michigan at the University of Michigan Biological Station. 1936 was the first recorded prescribed fire, and it was used for ecological research. And that research project is still ongoing. But since 1936, there hasn't really been prescribed fire other than for research until the late 20th century. In the late 80s and 90s, prescribed fire was starting to be used a little bit for land management for an ecological perspective. And then it really wasn't until the Michigan Prescribed Fire Council was created in 1999 that prescribed fire became more commonly used or more popular for land management. So returning fire to the land, present day, there are several organizations across Michigan that use prescribed fire, including Ottawa County Parks and the Michigan Prescribed Fire Council that I mentioned before. There are many uses for prescribed fire. It's used a lot in restoration and for preservation of existing landscapes and for research. And a pretty interesting statistics I found is that over 99% of prescribed burns are successful, which means that less than 1% of the prescribed fires escape control and become wildfires. So they're actually, when they're done safe and effectively, they are very efficient. The recovery of fire-dependent landscapes. There are many important benefits to this, and that is biodiversity preservation, habitat preservation, ecosystem services from the habitats that are restored, and returning cultural values to the land. So that brings us to fire in Ottawa County parks.
So I'll touch briefly on the history of prescribed fire in Ottawa County parks. So since 2012, we've utilized prescribed fire here, and historically those have been a few contracted burns each year. Maybe not even a few each year because contracted burns can be pretty expensive, and a lot of these contractors have a big list of burns they have to do every season, and they don't always get them in the right windows. So we do have a lot of fire dependent species like box turtles in our parks. Mentioned wild lupin, a couple other, we have a state threatened annual wildflower species that grows in one of our oak savannas. And so we have a lot of fire dependent species and habitats around our parks. And we have used it for restoration in those areas, as well as in areas where we want to limit the use of herbicide and chemical application. Fire is a great management tool for doing site prep and using it to help knock back invasive species or prevent them from becoming established. So I mentioned, contracted burns are really expensive, so you're limited to what you can afford and contractor availability. So there has been sort of on and off an in-house burn crew that has tackled smaller burns in Ottawa County parks. There hasn't been for a while until now, which we'll touch on a little bit later. But also some opportunities both in the past and coming up now with the Michigan Prescribed Fire Council, who last year hosted a collaborative burn week where some agencies got together, everybody submitted burn units that they wanted to burn during this, and then collectively went around and burn those with all their resources put together. So there's a lot more collaborative opportunities coming up in the future. But just, historically in our parks, fire has been around for about, 10 to 15 years now and used semi-frequently. And we'll expect that to expand more in the future as we focus more restoration on fire dependent habitats.
So at Ottawa County Parks, we're doing a few different monitoring and research projects surrounding prescribed fire. So this is the first project we've started here, and that is photo monitoring. It's pretty simple. We just have some designated points around a prescribed burn area, and we take pictures before the burn, just after the burn, and then weeks following the burn. And this is mostly just to see kind of a big picture how the burn is affecting the landscape. So I'm also a Grand Valley student, and through Grand Valley, me and a lab partner worked together to set up a monitoring project for a prairie specifically at Ottawa County Parks. And we're looking at woody encroachment and how prescribed fires will affect that woody encroachment. And you can kind of see in this picture, all these little dots are woody plants that have encroached onto this prairie. So the main objective of this research project is just to see how the fire is affecting it, and hopefully the fire will cut back on that woody encroachment. And then this is a new experiment that we're setting up here. And do you want to actually talk about this one? Because I don't know much about it yet.
Yeah, so Robinson Forest, if you're familiar with that property, it's one of our sort of medium-sized properties. It's about 60 acres. And when we acquired the property, most of the property was in red pine plantation. Some of our staff at the time, a naturalist, noticed in a couple openings in the woods and along trail sides and stuff, there were these fire dependent species like wild lupin and Canada frostweed. And then there is a pennyroyal, that state threatened annual wildflower that I mentioned. And all those species are oak savanna specialists. And so seeing these sort of lingering and hanging on in those little openings where there's enough sunlight to provide them with suitable habitat. Told us that that area historically was probably oak savanna, or just a very open oak woodland. So that pine was harvested in the mid 2000s, and a restoration began to, when logging was done, there was an effort to maintain some of the larger oaks that you see here. There's quite a few large white pines, and we're now managing that area as an oak pine savanna. So most of the property that was in red pine is pretty open right now. The west half of the property that did not get logged and was never put into pine plantation is pretty closed up right now, although we still see some of those fire dependent species pop up here and there in these little openings. So what we're looking to do is test different methods of expanding this oak pine barrens habitat along the west half of the property and expanding the core habitat that we've already established. So we're doing different combinations of mechanical thinning with chainsaws, combining that with burning, and then also testing whether spring burns or fall burns or a combination is going to help us accomplish our objectives best. So we're setting up some experimental plots right now. We've started doing some mechanical thinning, mostly on mesophytic species. Emily talked about mesification. So a lot of those are like red maple is a great example. It grows up through the canopies of oaks and other fire dependent species, and then it soon overtakes them. And when you get that canopy start to close up, it'll cool the area, traps a lot more moisture, and it's difficult to actually get fire to carry through one of those areas. So the idea there is we go through, clear it with chainsaws, thin it out a little bit ahead of time, and then in theory the fire will be more effective. So yeah, we're just testing those different methods and sort of different combinations there. All right. And so we were talking earlier before we started, there's kind of a spectrum out there of what you'll see for training and qualification standards especially in Michigan, but really across the country. So there is nothing in Michigan that says we need to have our staff certified in any way. In theory, the bare minimum that you need to conduct a prescribed fire in southern Michigan is a permit from your local fire department. Whether or not they grant you one is up to them and the fire chief, but there is currently no standard required training in order to conduct a burn. It's just the burn permit. So we don't take it lightly. When you start lighting a fire and you put fire out on a landscape, as well as all the smoke that your fire is going to produce, you can't just take it back. And so we're very intentional. Our staff are trained up. What I like to see as a minimum are the bolded trainings there. So those 4 online trainings, we have some staff that have done it in person. Emily has done 2 week-long fire camps right through Grand Valley that have covered quite a bit of this. And so most of our staff are trained up to these standards. I included a couple others as well. The ones that aren't bolded are, they're nice to have, but definitely not necessary. Our volunteers kind of have a mix of training as well. And so to volunteer on a fire with us, you don't have to be certified. We just won't put you in a situation where you'll need training that you don't have, essentially. So there's also a new certification that's sort of being rolled out by the Michigan DNR called the Certified Prescribed Burn Manager certification. And this was actually written into law in the early 2000s, but it never really got implemented until just a couple years ago. Things started to make progress. So I actually have been gone all week at it's only the second CPBM training that the DNR has offered in Michigan, but they're starting to certify folks. It requires a combination of these courses as well as their own multi-day training that you go through and documented burn experience and training. And what that does is when you submit all that material to their board, they can choose to certify you as a CPBM. And if you do that, that does give you the right to burn and conduct prescribed burns in Michigan. If you're certified as a certified prescribed burn manager, a fire department can choose not to grant you a permit, but they can't just tell you, no, you can't burn, because that is written into law through the Right to Forest Act that you can, with the certification, conduct prescribed fire for a variety of reasons. So the last training I'll mention on here are training exchanges, or TREX for short. So I was lucky enough to attend the first Michigan TREX, which was back in 2024, and it was about 2 weeks. We worked out of the Fort Custer Training Center, which is a military base down in Battle Creek, and spent pretty much all day, every day, either doing live fire, or if we weren't doing live fire, we were doing classroom activities. So there is another one coming up in September that'll be in northern Michigan as well, and we're hoping to send at least a staff or two to that. So this is not a workshop on conducting a prescribed burn, so I don't want to get too in depth, but I do just want to kind of show some of the things that we look at when we're planning out burns. Like we talked about before, we're not, just sitting on the truck watching it burn. There's a lot of, a lot of planning that goes into a fire. Some of the key components there are burn plan writing and prescriptions. And so prescriptions is, we identify temperature ranges, humidity ranges, acceptable winds that are both going to ensure that we're burning under safe conditions, as well as burning under conditions that are going to meet our ecological objectives. So if our goal, as in the Grand Ravines experiment that Emily mentioned, to reduce some of the woody shrubs, we're going to burn on a day where we're likely to get high enough fire behavior to actually impact those and cause mortality on those shrubs. So our humidity will be a little bit lower, our wind will probably be a little bit stronger. So all of our burns that we do have very in-depth plans written and prescriptions that are identified, again, to make sure that we're burning in safe conditions and also trying to get our ecological objectives met. So weather is a huge one. We could spend a whole hour or two talking just about weather. And I have here, every burn boss is an amateur meteorologist. So if you haven't heard burn boss, that's my favorite technical term or official term for a position. That is what the actual term for somebody conducting a burn that comes from the National Wildfire Coordinating Group. It is a burn boss. So during burn seasons, I'm checking the weather and studying the weather daily, trying to look at spreadsheets of all the different burns that we have planned, what the required winds are, and then looking at what the upcoming weather is going to be. So this is an example of the weather from a burn that I'll touch on in a little bit. And so you might not be able to see this all the way in the back, but this is hourly weather. So we have, partly sunny in the middle of the day. Temperatures are going to get up to 72 degrees. The relative humidity down to 42. That relative humidity and wind are going to be the biggest factors we look at. Humidity, if it starts getting into the low 30s, we're probably not going to conduct a burn. 42 is pretty good, especially for this area in particular. And then also looking at wind directions, we have an east to northeast wind, which is great. For this unit, I'll pull up the map in just a second, but yeah, just give you an idea of some of the things we look at. Mixing height and ventilation rate as well. That tells us how the smoke is going to behave in those areas and how well it's going to lift off the ground, because what we don't want is to light a fire and just have the smoke spread all over and make our neighbors unhappy and have to deal with that too. So you can't, maybe you can see it back here, but there's a little section that's highlighted in green. And what that tells you is that's essentially great smoke lift and ventilation. and that's a good time to conduct a burn. When you get into the yellow, the orange, and the red around 5 o'clock here, that tells you should have your fire out by then, because the smoke is going to start to settle down on the ground. So smoke management is just as big of a deal as keeping your fire and the flames contained. We also look at sensitive areas like hospitals, schools, if there are any nursing homes, neighbors who might have respiratory issues, and we do wide notifications far ahead of time for all of our burns to make sure that if there's anyone that wants specific day of notification, we give them a call or go knock on their door to let them know when we're going to start burning. So for all of our units, we know where the smoke sensitive areas are around them, and that also goes into our prescriptions of, if there's a school to the east, we're not going to burn with a west wind that's going to push smoke toward that school. Permitting, again, the Michigan DNR is the permitting agency in Michigan, but if you're south of Muskegon, Newaygo County, and over, they actually sort of farm that out to the local fire departments to issue those permits, because they don't have enough staff to do that down here. So north of that line, the Michigan DNR handles all the permitting, but down here it's on a local level. So we work with all of our local fire departments to get permits for all of our burns. Notifications will be conducted, way in advance through mailing and door hangers. And then if we need to, we'll do some day of notifications. We'll also prepare burn breaks, and then in our plan goes our ignition patterns, and I'll talk about those in a little bit here. So yeah, just to touch again on, this is an example of one of our burn units. This is a smaller one. It's about 3 acres total. And there is a road right here, a greenhouse right here, and then a couple houses down here. So in this burn plan and the prescription, I've excluded an east wind, I've excluded a west wind. So we would not burn this unit under conditions that are going to push smoke toward all those sensitive areas. So this is actually the weather for that burn. And you can see this northeast wind that we had was great, because it kept all the smoke this way. And just on the other side of the river is 150 acres of our property. So any smoke that did stay on the ground just ended up on our own property again. So not to bore you with weather, but I really do like weather. So just kind of looking out, a week ahead, trying to plan what kind of burns can we get in. This is an example of what we might look at. So this is daily metrics like relative humidity, wind speed, and direction. Again, these two are going to be the biggest that tell us when we can and can't burn. Just some sort of complexities to look for this. It's the same burn unit that I just showed a map of previously. We've got low 40 relative humidity, and then the next 2 days, you see the humidity go up to 93, which is awesome, because you don't have to put as much time and effort into mop up, which will be putting out anything that's still kind of smoking and lingering, because that humidity is going to go up and it's going to make sure that everything's really shut down. So that's kind of the best thing you can see when you're planning to burn, is a great burn window followed by a period of low winds and high humidity, because there's not going to be a chance of your fire picking back up days on. So just one more example of, I mentioned mixing height and ventilation rate, which are two things we look for when we're planning where our smoke is going to go and how it's going to behave. And you can see the day we burned on that Wednesday, we had a great window. The rest of the week, there's no chance that we're going to be burning on those days. So that's just kind of to show you some of the components that we look for and some of the intricacies when we are doing these plans and looking at all of our different areas that we want to burn. There's a lot that goes into that decision making. So I do want to touch briefly on smoke management again, because that is arguably more important than the flames that you're managing. A lot of accidents and lawsuits even from prescribed fires have resulted not from the fire escaping, but say your smoke clouds out a highway and you cause a pile up, which has happened before, you can be held liable for that. You're causing injury, you're causing harm. And so the smoke is just as important as, again, containing your fire. So this is one example of a model that we use. It's through a software called vSmoke, and you put in your information about the area you want to burn, and then the weather conditions that you're burn under, and then it gives you areas that'll be impacted according to the air quality index. So the past couple of years, when we've gotten all that Canadian wildfire smoke, and yeah, you probably have seen these categories before. When it starts to get, really when it gets to 150, you'll see, you'll get a warning on your phone. You'll start to get alerts and say, try to limit time outside and exposure to the air. The DNR also asks people don't burn in the first place when it's, when you get up to 150. But what you can see here, this is Eastmanville Farm, where our operations center is. And all of the high impact areas on here with the winds and everything that I put in are going to stay on. So there's no houses in here, there are no roads in here. All of this is in our property. 51 to 100, you do see some roads included in that, a lot of farmland. That category, you can't really even, see it. You might be able to smell a little bit of smoke, but it's going to be very temporary, and it's not going to be obstructing roadways or anything. Whereas if I saw, a road going through the middle of our unit here, I would be a little concerned, and we would probably work in some traffic control to our burn planning, or just burn with a different direction. So that's just a little bit about smoke management and forecasting. And then I did want to share this video and just kind of talk through, as it plays, some of the different strategies they're utilizing and ignition techniques, just so you can kind of get a picture of some of the different strategies we use. So this is going to touch on backing fire. So what you'll see is the wind is blowing this direction. And what a backing fire does is it moves it backs itself into the wind. So you can see the flames and the smoke are moving off that direction. A backing fire is going to be very low flame lengths because it doesn't have wind feeding it oxygen in the direction of the fuel. And so typically when we start a burn, we want to sort of create a box that the fire can't escape. And the first part of that box, we're going to put in fire because it's, again, very low intensity, very low rate of spread. And so almost always we're going to start our fire on the downwind side of a unit. And that just ensures, the fire can't go that way once we have all this unburned or all this burned fuel in place. These are called strip heads. So a head fire, again, wind is heading this way. A head fire is going to be moving with the wind. So now you light upwind of and you can see these flame lengths compared to the initial backing fire that I showed. Quite a bit of a difference because now you have the wind blowing oxygen into all that fuel. So head fires, once you have a good amount of perimeter in place, you can use head fires and they will burn into that already burned fuel and then just kind of put themselves out because they don't have anywhere else. So strip heads are often used to speed up burning an area. If you have a lot of acreage to cover or, limited window that's good weather for that day, you might use head fires to try to speed up. Yep. Oh, okay. Yep. Yeah. So usually when you do strip head fires, you have a couple people moving parallel to each other, and that ensures that you have a couple rows of fire. You can see how intense that's getting. But if you had another row that had already burned there, it'll keep it from getting quite as intense. This is a flanking fire, which is going to be perpendicular to the wind. And that's kind of a mix between a backing fire and a head fire. So you'll see these two igniters here moving down toward the bottom of the screen. and then that fire is going to slowly spread outward toward each other. Fire is also, it's like a magnet, and so when these two spots start to get close enough to each other, they'll actually speed up and kind of start to close that gap a little bit quicker. So flanking fires are a great way to speed up ignition, but also keep it controlled. Head fires can get pretty intense, especially in grassy fuels that light up really quickly. Flanking fires are a good sort of mix between the two. Point source fire, they're just lighting little spots here that are going to slowly grow and expand and kind of move in every direction. These are great for forested areas, because when you use this grid method, you typically don't get a big head fire, which is going to cause large flame lengths and potentially kill trees. It's more of a slow sort of creeping out. You get a little bit more of a random effect, which also gives you sort of diverse burn effects on the landscape too. So point source fire is another commonly used tactic. And then ring fire, I will say this is logistically the easiest, because you just light up the whole unit. And I mentioned fire is like a magnet, just kind of vacuums everything in, but you'll see at the end of this video how intense it gets. We don't love ring fires, rarely use them for a few reasons. If there's wildlife in this unit, maybe rabbits, or depending on how late in the season. We also look at, I didn't mention, but if we're burning the grassland, we're looking to burn before or after anything is in there nesting. But say you had, some turkeys and some little poults running through here, a ring fire is going to entrap wildlife inside of it. So typically what we're going to be doing is using backing fires, which are slow moving, flanking fires, point source ignition, and that gives things a chance to move around and get out of the area. Whereas a ring fire could entrap things potentially. It also gets very intense in the center. If you had used this in a forested area or something, you're gonna create a big dead zone in the middle of the area you're burning, which you don't really want, because it just gets so intense right in the middle and turns into essentially a big vacuum. So yeah, compared to the first couple strategies that we used, you can see what a ring fire looks like. So not a typical tactic that we're gonna use, but a big advantage to this, notice how the smoke is just, there's so much convective force from all that heat rising at once that all that smoke up and out. So if you were in an urban area, say like Hager Park, there's a grassland there. We're looking to burn a few acres this spring. There's a lot of, suburbs around there. There's a school over to the east. And so this could be a great option where you could use a ring fire, and it's going to get all the smoke up off the ground and into the atmosphere before it can spread out and obstruct anything. It's rarely used, but they do certainly have a purpose as well. And on all these burns, we're not using one or the other. We're using combinations. They can be a little bit like, see, fuels are responding to what you're doing. Winds can shift unexpectedly, and you as the burn boss have to kind of just always be watching, paying attention, and adjusting your strategies. So real quick, just some equipment. How do we conduct burns when we actually get to a burn day and we've decided that it is a go for the day? We're going to have folks with hand tools, water backpacks that can spray water and put out fires, UTVs, ATVs, and trucks with pumps. So you can see our ATV here with about 70 gallons of water on it, our truck here with 150 gallons, and there's also a side-by-side here with about 100 gallons of water. And so we almost always have those resources available to us. We're going to have staff and volunteers, and in the burn plan, every unit has a minimum number of people that we need to burn that spot. So You also notice everybody's wearing yellow here. So this is Nomex, which is flame resistant material. And so it's not required for a burn, but we do ask everyone's either wearing Nomex or cotton. Synthetic fibers and things can catch on fire, they can melt with heat. And so we do, you'll see a lot of hard hats, safety glasses, leather gloves, leather boots. There's a lot of personal protective equipment that goes into it too. Logistics, we'll have briefings, and then everyone will have an assignment, whether you're going to be igniting today, you're going to be on lookout today, you're going to be carrying this hand tool and watching this line. So everybody gets an assignment. And then there's a command structure. So there's your burn boss. You often have a line boss, which is in charge of smaller groups of people around. And all that is sorted out prior to the burn. So with that, you want to take us home?
Yeah, so I'm just going to cover the burns that we conducted last year in 2025. So this is the first burn that we did last year at Stearns Creek, the south portion of it. And this was a spring burn. We covered just under 24 acres total, and we split that into 2 different units. We actually contracted this burn out to Stantec, which is a separate organization that they came in and did the burn for us, but we still assisted, and we had several volunteers that joined us for this as well. The objectives of this burn were to stimulate seed bank germination, control invasive species. There were a lot of like spotted knapweed and Scots pine, which are invasive, that we don't want in there. And we want to reduce the understory of the upland species, so that there are a lot of like younger oaks in this habitat that we want to reduce, so they don't crowd out the canopy. And then for fire effects, this is just kind of what we saw the fire doing to the plant communities. We saw a lot of root crown scorching, and that's like at the base of the plant. I guess the root crown, like just above the roots, was scorched. We saw lots of wilted leaves on lower branches. Yeah, so on to my next slide. This is, hold on. Okay. This was an aerial photo of the burn unit. On the left, or yes, your left, was what we planned to burn. And then on the right is what we actually burned. And this is actually a Google image of, you can see the dark areas where the fire actually burned. But that big red X is where we chose not to burn, because the day of the fire, the winds had shifted to an undesirable location, and it would have smoked out the neighborhood back in there. So we didn't burn that spot so that the smoke didn't get to those neighbors. And then this little yellow circle down here, we actually had what we call a slop over, and that's when the fire escapes the burn unit and starts burning an area that we don't want burned. But we got it under control. It was a little scary in the moment, though, I'm not gonna lie. Yeah, other than that, it went really well. So another burn we did last year was at Stearns Creek on the north side. And this was our first in-house burn with only Ottawa County Park staff, and then we had a few volunteers as well. The objectives of this burn was to reduce canopy cover, increase native species diversity, reduce the cover and density of invasive species and aggressive native species, and provide training and skill development opportunities for staff and volunteers. So again, in this area, we had a lot of spotted knapweed, which is invasive, and we have a lot of really good native species too. We actually have lupin in this area, which is a fire-dependent species, but we also have really aggressive native species like winged sumac and aspen and cottonwood. The effects we saw on this burn, the leaves on the lower branches had wilted. We had more scorched root crowns. And this burn actually had a pretty variable burn pattern. We call it a mosaic burn pattern. It's actually, depending on the burn, that can be ideal that you want to see that in, because that tends to create a more biodiverse habitat resulting from that. But this is the burn unit. It's just little. I think Tyler talked about it earlier with the greenhouse in the neighborhood nearby. And then this burn, we also recorded a lot of the weather that happened, and this burn went really well. There's not much to say about it. It was pretty good. And then the third burn that we did last year was at Eastmanville Farm. This was a fall burn. It was also pretty small, only about 4 acres. Also in-house, we didn't contract anyone out for this, but we did have a lot of volunteers. We had a lot of Grand Valley students who wanted experience, who joined us on this burn. So the objectives of this burn were to reduce woody encroachment. This is a prairie habitat that we're trying to restore, so we don't want those woody species in there. We want to stimulate the seed bank, so we want native species to grow up from the burned areas. We want to reduce the cover and density of invasive species. There's a lot of teasel, specifically in this field, that is not native and that we don't want there. And we wanted to provide training and skill development opportunities for staff and for the volunteers that were joining us. So this is a map of the burn unit that we did here. That red section is where we did not burn. We actually ran out of time, and that's mostly due to we were having a lot of issues getting this site to burn at all because it was very moist. We were able to burn a lot of it, but not as much as we had hoped. It resulted in a more of a mosaic burn pattern, whereas we would have wanted a more continuous burn pattern for this area. In terms of weather, this burn unit was pretty chill. The relative humidity had dropped pretty significantly though, but that was mostly due to the fire itself. So fires will usually make the air around them dry up. So that was pretty typical. Yeah.
So last thing we'll touch on is burns coming up for this year. So this spring, we've got quite a few planned. We don't always get everything that we have planned completed, but at Eastmanville Farm, we'll be hosting a couple things. So that's where our NRM staff work out of. That's where our office is and all of our equipment. We are going to hold a annual staff and volunteer training. And so there is a sheet going around. If you'd like to volunteer on a burn with us, you can put your email on there. We'll add you to our mailing list, and you're welcome to attend that training if you want to learn more. We're also going to host a Learn and Burn out there, which will be an event where we have our staff, we'll have some folks from the Michigan Prescribed Fire Council, and we'll have sort of a demonstration burn and some educational components so you can come out, learn more about fire, and you can actually see prescribed fire being conducted. So that is just entirely weather dependent. It'll depend on how quickly those dried grasses, well, they were dried in the fall, and after a snow melt and all this rain, we'll just kind of have to see when those become burnable. So we're aiming for late April, early May potentially. So keep an eye on our website and our social media and stuff. Details will be coming out as soon as we have a date picked out. A couple others are Grand Ravines and Hager Park, which will both be grassland burns, and we're using fire as a tool to prep the site to apply native seed. So we'll burn it to get all that thatch and all that dead material off, And we have a lot of seed that we collected last fall, and we're going to disperse those seeds at that site. And then Robinson Forest will be that experiment that we mentioned. We're burning a couple small acre-sized plots. And then Bur Oak West, there's an area we are working on some spotted knapweed management and trying to get some more natives established. So we'll use that again for site prep. Summer and fall, we will burn again at Robinson Forest. We're going to burn out here hopefully as well. We have a few acres picked out, and we're going to be targeting some of the actually native grasses that have become quite aggressive out here and really crowded out some of the wildflower species. And then we'll burn again at the farm. So we have a lot of non-native grassland at Eastmanville Farm. So we're utilizing a technique where we burn certain patches, remove the litter, and then again apply native seed. And it takes longer to get natives established, but you don't have to apply a bunch of chemical in order to site prep it that way. So with that, I'm going to come back to questions. I just want to highlight coming up on April 2nd, and then again on May 7th, one at Hemlock Crossing, and then the same presentation at Hager Park. We will have the secret lives of frogs and salamanders. So if you enjoyed the format that we did today, we'll have different presenters next time for salamanders, but we'll have another round of presentations coming up. So be sure to check those out, and those will all be on the program calendar too.